Hi guys, welcome back. This is Dr. Gallegos. This is lesson 6.1 of our 4th grade math. Now in this lesson, we're going to learn some, and maybe it's some review, multiplication properties so that we can use those properties to become better at our operations. Now we have been working with a lot of multiplication and division. We've used the multiplication table to make sure that our work makes the most sense. So let's look at these properties and how we can use the properties in mental math. So the first property I want to talk about is called the associative property. We've learned the associative property in addition and how you can group things together and still get the same result in terms of addition. So the associative property states that the way the factors are grouped now in terms of multiplication is not going to change the product. So if I have 8 times 3 times 3, and I switch it to something like grouping 8 times 3 in parentheses times 3, I'm still using the same numbers, I'm still multiplying those three numbers together, so it's not going to change at all what the product is. So I can say 8 times 3 like this, times 3 uses the same numbers as 8 times, and then my grouping. Now, just a reminder, these are parentheses. They're used as grouping symbols in mathematics. So, all right, so we've got 8 times 3 times 3 and 8 times 3 times 3. So, still get the same result. Let's test that. All right, so we've got over here 8 times 3 times 3, or either one. I've got 8 times 3 times 3 is 9, so 8 times 9 is 72, and I can check that with my facts, my multiplication table. So 8 times 3 times 3 then is 72. So if I do it on the other side, if I group 8 times 3 together over here, then that's 24. 24 times 3 is still 72. So you see, it doesn't matter how they're grouped, you're still going to get the same product. Now, the other property that I want to introduce you today to is the distributive property. Now, the distributive property says that you can break apart one of the factors. Remember, we worked on factors in last lesson, and multiply its parts by the other factor. So let's take 7 times 12, and let's use the distributive property to break that apart. So we can break 12 apart, and we can easily use mental math, right? So 12, instead of having 7 times 12, we can say that 12 is 10 plus 2. Now, we can multiply both parts by 7. So we can say 7 times 10, right? And then 7 times 2. So 7 times 10 is 70. 7 times 2 is 14. Therefore, and then 70 plus 14 is 84. So the result is 84. So you can also check that result with your multiplication table, or if you've already memorized those multiplication tables, then that's how you work this. So again, we can take we can use the distributive property to break apart maybe a larger number into easier to use numbers, and then in this case we used 10 plus 2 because 7 times 10 is really easy to have remembered from my multiplication facts. Okay, so let's look at the third property here. The third property is called the commutative property. Now, the commutative property we used in addition before, but let's use it in multiplication and see what it means. The commutative property says that you can multiply numbers in any order and the product's going to be the same. Difference between the associative property is the associative says you can group them in any order. And the commutative property supports that same notion because the commutative property says we can multiply numbers in any order. I can multiply 3 times 10 or 10 times 3. It doesn't matter. I'm still going to get 30, right? So that's what it says. The order in which you multiply numbers does not change the product. Next property is the zero property, and then we'll look at the identity property. The zero property states that the product of any number and 0 is going to be 0. So it doesn't matter if you have 1,000 times 0, it's still going to be 0. 12 times 0, 0. 56 times 0, 0. 0 times 0, 0. 1 million times 0 is going to be 0. So that's the zero property of multiplication. The identity property, I think of identity as identifying myself, right? So that's how I remember. The identity property says that the product of any number and 1 is that number. So 1 times 1 equal 1, right? 2 times 1 equal 1. Now you can go follow that on your multiplication table. So 1 million times 1 is 1 million. So that's the identity property. So quick review before I get you to work. We have the associative property of multiplication says that you can group them, our grouping symbols are parentheses. You can group them in any order, you're still going to get the same product. The distributive property says that you can break apart one of the factors and multiply its parts by the other factors. So if you multiply 1, so we took 10 plus 2, then we had to multiply 7 times 10, and then 7 times 2, and then add those together. The commutative property said that you can multiply those numbers in any order and still get the same product. Zero property says that any number multiplied by 0 is 0. The identity property says that any number multiplied by 1 is going to be that number. All right, guys, get to work on using your properties.